The wind had a way of speaking in Wyoming, low and steady, carrying dust, memory, and the sting of words people never said to your face. Clara Dawson heard it all the same. She stood in the shadow of her father's empty barn, a crumpled letter in her hand, the paper thin and worn from too many readings. It was the fourth in as many years, and it ended just like the others. You are a fine woman, Miss Dawson, but I do not believe we would suit. A wife should be gentle in form as well as spirit. Gentle in form. That was the polite way of saying she was too broad in the shoulders, too strong in the arms, and too brown in the skin from years spent behind a plow. Her father was gone now. The farm sold for taxes, and the little she earned mending harnesses in town barely kept her fed. Folks passed her in the street with nods that were more pity than greeting. Some were openly cruel. Built like a blacksmith. One man chuckled once as she walked by, not bothering to lower his voice. But Clara had learned not to let her face show the hurt. There was a kind of dignity in silence, even if it was a lonely sort. That afternoon, as she crossed the single street of Dry Creek, she noticed the saloon door swing wide and James Hawkins step into the sun. Most folks called him Hawk, partly for his sharp eyes, partly for the way he kept his own counsel. He was a tall man, the lean strength of a rider in every line of him, though his hair had begun to silver at the temples. He owned the largest cattle spread in the county and had been a widower for nearly 6 years. Hawk's gaze found her through the bustle of wagons and riders. It wasn't the look most men gave her. No quick judgment, no flicker of amusement, just steady regard, like he was measuring something deeper than what the eye could see. "Miss Dawson," he said when she came near. His voice was low, carrying over the clatter of hooves. "Could I trouble you for a word?" She hesitated. "Of course, Mr. Hawkins." They stepped aside, into the shade of the telegraph office. Hawk wasted no time with pleasantries. "I've a proposition for you," he said. "It's not the sort most women dream of, but it's honest." Clara crossed her arms, wary. "Go on." "I need someone on the ranch I can trust," Hawk said. "Someone who can work as well as keep the house. My neighbors won't stop pressing me to remarry. They think it's their business, whether I have a wife or not. And I reckon I'd rather choose one myself than be pestered into some match I don't want." She studied him, unsure whether to feel insulted or intrigued. "So you're asking for a what?" "Marriage of convenience." His eyes didn't waver. "That's the truth of it. You'd have a place to live, work worth doing, and my respect. I can't promise more." Clara felt a slow heat rise in her chest, not from embarrassment, but from the bluntness of it. He wasn't offering charity. He was offering partnership. Still, she asked, "Why me?" "Because I've seen you work," Hawk said simply. "You don't scare easy, and you don't break. I don't give a damn what the town says about a woman's shape. I care whether she'll stand when the wind turns mean." For a moment, Clara could almost believe he meant it. Almost. "And if I say yes?" "Then we'll be married before week's end," Hawk replied. "The sooner it's done, the sooner the talk will fade." She thought of her empty room above the harness shop, the cold mornings with no one to speak to, the endless effort to prove her worth to a world that had already decided against her. She thought of the 4 rejection letters folded away in her trunk. "All right, Mr. Hawkins," she said at last. "You've got yourself a wife." They married 3 days later in the small whitewashed church at the edge of town. No flowers adorned the aisle. No music swelled from the organ, just Pastor Rourke's steady voice and the scrape of boots on wooden floorboards. The townsfolk came, not out of joy, but because curiosity was a powerful lure. Clara could feel their eyes on her as she stood at the front, the plain blue of her best dress, doing nothing to soften her strong frame. She caught snatches of whispers. Never thought he'd settle for her, and must be desperate, but kept her gaze fixed on Hawk. He met her look with quiet steadiness, giving nothing away. When the vows were spoken, he slid the ring onto her finger without hesitation. His hand was warm, his grip sure. "By the power vested in me," Pastor Rourke said, "I now pronounce you man and wife." There was no kiss, just a nod from Hawk, a polite bow of her head, and the knowledge that life had shifted in some irrevocable way. The ride to his ranch was long and mostly silent, the hoofbeats of his bay gelding and her borrowed mare the only rhythm between them. The land spread wide in all directions, sagebrush flats giving way to rolling pasture, with the distant blue of mountains like a painted backdrop. When they reached the Hawkins spread, the sheer size of it struck her. Fenced paddocks, neat barns, a big two-story house with a wraparound porch. It was the kind of place that could either shelter or swallow a person whole. Hawk dismounted and helped her down, his hand firm at her elbow. "You'll have the east bedroom," he said. "It gets the morning light. Supper's at 6, but we eat when the work's done, not by the clock." She nodded, taking in the smell of fresh-cut hay, the lowing of cattle somewhere beyond the barn. This was no small task she'd stepped into. As she climbed the porch steps, she caught sight of one of the ranch hands watching from the shadows of the barn, a tall man with narrow eyes and a smirk that didn't reach them. He tipped his hat in a way that felt more like a challenge than a greeting. Clara turned away, telling herself it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had a roof, a purpose, and perhaps, if she was lucky, a place to belong. But as the evening wind picked up, carrying with it the far-off sound of cattle lowing, she wondered if she had just traded one kind of loneliness for another. And somewhere deep in the quiet between them, she sensed that Hawk's offer had come with more than he had told her. Something waited in the shadows of this ranch, a truth not yet spoken, but certain to change everything. The wind carried the scent of fresh hay through the open windows of the sprawling McAllister ranch house. Emma had been inside for barely 2 days, yet each corner whispered of the life she'd been thrust into. A life that wasn't hers, at least not yet. She stood in the parlor that first morning, fingers trailing over the ornate wooden mantel. A rifle hung above it, polished so clean she could see her reflection in its barrel. Around her, the furniture was sturdy, the kind of pieces built to last through storms and hard times, much like the man who owned them. That man, Cattle Baron Samuel McAllister, was at the far end of the room, bent over a ledger at his desk. He glanced up only briefly, acknowledging her with a nod before his eyes fell back to numbers. It was the same measured, guarded politeness he'd shown since she'd arrived. Emma found herself wondering what he thought of her when no one else was looking. Did he see her as the townsfolk had, a woman whose strong frame and plain features didn't fit their idea of beauty? Or did he see something else entirely? They had spoken little since their wedding, which had been quick and without celebration. She had been grateful for the absence of gawkers, but the silence between them now felt like a hollow space that needed filling. At breakfast, she made the first attempt. "The biscuits, they taste better than anything I've had since my mother's table," she said, trying to spark conversation. Samuel looked up from his coffee, one eyebrow lifting slightly. "That'd be Mrs. Porter's doing. She's been cooking here longer than I've been running cattle." His voice was deep and even, carrying a weight that seemed to anchor the air around him. She wanted to ask more, about his ranch, his life, anything that would bridge the gulf between them, but he returned to his coffee as though retreating behind an invisible wall. After the meal, Mrs. Porter, a stout woman with a no-nonsense manner, handed Emma a folded list. "Mr. McAllister likes the household run proper. You'll find the chores here. Don't worry about the barn yet. He keeps that part of the work for himself and the hands." Emma scanned the list. Laundry, linens, accounting for pantry stores. It was honest work, and she was no stranger to it. But the neat handwriting at the bottom caught her attention. Tend to the rose garden. When she stepped outside that afternoon, she found the roses on the west side of the house, their blooms vivid against the wide, golden plains. Kneeling, she brushed her fingers over the petals. The care put into them was evident. Someone had been tending them long before she arrived. "What do you think of Em?" Samuel's voice startled her. She looked up to find him standing near the garden gate, hat in hand. "They're beautiful," she said, shielding her eyes from the sun. "I wouldn't have expected roses to thrive out here." He stepped closer, his gaze on the flowers. "They take work. You prune too much, you kill the bush. Too little, and it grows wild and weak. My late wife planted them, kept them alive even through the worst drought." Emma felt the words sink into her chest. There it was, a glimpse into the man behind the guarded eyes. She wanted to ask about his wife, but the shadow that crossed his face warned her not to push. Over the next days, they fell into an unspoken rhythm. She worked the house. He worked the land. They crossed paths at meals and in the hallways. Brief exchanges replacing long silences. Yet there were moments, small and unplanned, when the distance between them narrowed. One evening, she found him in the barn, tending to an injured calf. He was on his knees, gently binding the animal's leg. The tenderness in his touch surprised her. "You handle them like they're glass," she remarked. He gave a faint smile. "You'd be surprised how much more they respond to kindness than force." It wasn't lost on her that the same could be said for people. That night, as a storm rolled over the plains, lightning lit the windows, followed by the deep growl of thunder. Emma had just finished securing the shutters in her room when a knock came at the door. Samuel stood there, a lantern in hand. "Best to stay downstairs tonight," he said. "The wind's been known to tear at the upper rooms when it gets bad." They spent the night in the parlor, the storm thrashing against the house like a living thing. Mrs. Porter retired early, leaving them alone by the fire. The glow cast shadows over Samuel's face, softening the sharp planes of his jaw. "Does it always rage like this?" she asked. He leaned back in his chair. "Sometimes worse. I've seen barns ripped from their foundations. You learn to respect the wind out here." There was a long pause. Then, as if the storm had loosened something inside him, he said, "People talk, I know, about why I married you, about why you agreed, but it's no one's business but ours." Emma held his gaze, the fire crackling between them. "And what is our business, Samuel?" He considered her for a moment, as though weighing how much to reveal. "For now, it's keeping this ranch standing and seeing that neither of us has reason to regret the bargain we made." It wasn't the answer she'd hoped for, but it was more than she'd been given before. When the storm finally broke near dawn, she found herself reluctant to leave the parlor. Something had shifted, not enough to be called closeness, but enough to suggest it was possible. In the days that followed, Emma noticed small changes. Samuel lingered a little longer at the breakfast table. His eyes met hers more often, and sometimes there was the faintest glimmer of something unspoken there. Trust, perhaps, or the beginnings of it. But with each step toward familiarity came the quiet reminder of the unknown. Samuel carried a secret. She could feel it in the way his words sometimes stopped short, in the guarded way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. And though Emma had come to this ranch as the bride no one wanted, she was beginning to suspect that her new husband had wanted her for a reason far beyond what he'd let her believe. The thought was both unsettling and impossible to ignore. The dawn broke over the Wilson ranch in a spill of molten gold, stretching long shadows across the rolling pastures. Amelia had grown accustomed to the rhythm of ranch life, the lowing of cattle at first light, the smell of damp earth after a night's dew, and the occasional warm brush of a horse's muzzle against her hand. Yet that morning carried a different energy. Jacob was up before her, moving quietly but with purpose, as though he had somewhere to be before the rest of the ranch stirred. She watched from the kitchen window as he saddled his bay stallion, Cole, and rode off toward the northern fields. There was a tautness in his posture, a guarded determination she hadn't seen before. Amelia's curiosity, once kept at bay by her shyness, had grown since their marriage. Jacob remained a puzzle to her, a man capable of great kindness, yet wrapped in layers of silence. That morning, she felt an undeniable pull to know where he went when he thought no one was watching. By mid-morning, she took her own horse, Daisy, and rode the long trail toward the north pasture. The air was crisp, scented with wild sage, and the sky stretched endlessly above her. When she reached the ridge that overlooked the far field, she spotted him. Jacob was kneeling in the grass beside a small, weathered cabin half hidden by overgrown willows. His hat was off, his head bowed. She edged closer, careful not to make a sound. Through the tall grass, she saw his lips move in what looked like a prayer. But it wasn't the praying that caught her attention. It was the small wooden cross planted in the earth before him, its letters worn nearly smooth by wind and rain. Her breath caught. It was a grave. Jacob's voice carried faintly in the still air. "I'm keeping my word, Sarah. The ranch is safe. The boy, he's safe too. You'd be proud. Amelia froze. Sarah? The boy. The words seemed to slice through her. She had never heard him speak of either. When Jacob finally rose and turned, Amelia ducked behind a cluster of mesquite. Her heart pounded with the realization she had stumbled onto something deeply private, a piece of his past he clearly didn't intend to share. She stayed hidden until he mounted Cole and rode back toward the ranch. Only then did she approach the little grave. The carving was faint but legible. Sarah Wilson, beloved wife and mother. Amelia's throat tightened. The woman had been his first wife, and if the inscription spoke truth, she had been a mother. But to whom? No child lived at the ranch. The thought gnawed at Amelia as she rode home. That night, over supper, Jacob was quieter than usual. He asked about the day's chores, about the hens she had taken to feeding, but there was a distracted look in his eyes. Amelia wanted to confront him, to ask about Sarah and the boy, but fear held her back. Their marriage, though legal, still rested on fragile trust. After the dishes were washed, she joined him on the porch where the prairie wind hummed through the cottonwoods. For a long moment, they watched the stars appear one by one. Then softly, she ventured, "You go north in the mornings sometimes, toward the Willow Grove." Jacob's jaw tightened. "I do. There's a grave there," she continued. Her voice trembled despite her effort to steady it. "Sarah's grave." He didn't look at her. "Yes. And the boy." His hand stilled on the armrest. "That's not a road you want to walk, Amelia." The dismissal stung, but it also told her that the story mattered enough for him to keep it locked away. She wanted to say she wasn't afraid of his ghosts, but he rose abruptly, muttered a good night, and went inside. The following week brought a turn in the weather. Heavy rain rolled in from the west, swelling the creeks and turning the pastures into mud-laden traps. On the third day of storms, Amelia was helping in the barn when a rider came hard through the gates. It was a neighbor, Hank Collier, his oilskin coat dripping. "Jacob," Hank shouted, "one of your strays is tangled up down in the north pasture, near the old willow cabin." Amelia saw Jacob's face flicker with something more than concern for cattle. Without a word, he grabbed his coat, and she, without asking, followed. The ride was brutal. Rain stung their faces, and the wind howled like a living thing. When they reached the pasture, Amelia understood why Jacob had been uneasy. The cabin's door was swinging open, and a thin wisp of smoke curled from its chimney. Inside, huddled near the hearth, was a boy, no older than 8, with hair the color of corn silk and eyes that mirrored Jacob's. He was wrapped in a threadbare blanket, shivering. "Ethan," Jacob breathed, dropping to his knees. The boy's face lit up, and he scrambled into Jacob's arms without hesitation. Amelia stood in stunned silence. This was the boy, the one Jacob had promised to keep safe. "How long have you been here?" Jacob asked gently, but the boy only buried his face against his chest. Jacob looked over at Amelia, the truth heavy in his eyes. "He's my son." The world seemed to still around her. The lonely widower she had married out of mutual need was a father who had been keeping his child hidden in a cabin on the far edge of the ranch. They brought Ethan back through the storm, wrapping him in dry blankets and feeding him hot stew. As the boy slept in the loft, Jacob sat at the kitchen table, his hands curled around a mug he hadn't touched. "She was my whole world," he said quietly, not looking at Amelia. "Sarah, when she died, I thought I'd lost everything, but I still had Ethan. I kept him away from the ranch, because there are people who'd use him to hurt me. Folks who'd take the ranch if they could, knowing he's the heir." Amelia listened, her own heart tightening. The pieces fit together now, his solitary rides, his guardedness, his refusal to speak of the past. He had been protecting more than just his land. "I won't let anything happen to him," Jacob finished. "That's my promise." She met his gaze steadily. "Then it's my promise too." For the first time, something shifted in his expression, a crack in the wall he had built between them. Gratitude, and maybe something warmer, flickered there. Outside, the rain eased. The air carried the scent of wet earth, and a quiet that felt almost like peace. But Amelia knew this was only the beginning. The secret in the pasture had changed everything, and now it was part of her story too. The morning sun spilled molten gold over the rolling pastures, painting the world in warm hues that seemed almost at odds with the storm brewing beyond the ranch's borders. Lila stood at the veranda rail, her fingers curled around the worn wood, her gaze fixed on the distant dust rising along the trail. She didn't need to ask who was coming. News traveled fast in small towns, and faster still when scandal clung to it. It had been 2 weeks since the secret had come out, since Eli's confession about the inheritance, the false poverty, and the way the marriage had begun as a business bargain. But the world didn't hear the truth the way they had lived it. Rumors had twisted it into something sharp and ugly. People whispered that she had been bought, that Eli had been tricked, that love, if it existed at all, was nothing more than a lie they told themselves. She turned as Eli stepped onto the porch, his boots heavy against the wood. His shirt was open at the collar, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and the hard set of his jaw told her he'd already heard what she had. "They're coming," she said quietly. "I know." The wind caught the brim of his hat, lifting it slightly before settling it back. "Let them come. We've got nothing to hide." Her heart clenched. "Eli, we might not, but they'll see only what they want to see. They'll tear us apart before they understand." He stepped closer, resting his calloused hand over hers on the railing. "Then we stand together, like we always said we would." The first riders appeared in view, men and women from town, some in buggies, others on horseback. Not a mob exactly, but a gathering of curious eyes and judgmental stares. Inside the house, the air felt heavier. The scent of coffee lingered, though neither had drunk much. Eli poured himself a cup anyway, more for something to hold than for thirst. Lila sat at the kitchen table, trying not to fidget. Every tick of the clock on the wall was a reminder that in moments, their private life would be anything but private. When the knock came, it wasn't timid. 3 hard raps on the door. Eli opened it to find Sheriff Warren standing there, hat in hand but eyes sharp. Behind him, the townsfolk shifted restlessly. "Morning, Eli." "Lila." His voice was polite, but edged with formality. "Mind if we come in?" "You've already decided what you're here for," Eli said evenly. "Might as well say it." The sheriff glanced back at the crowd, then lowered his voice. "People have questions. Questions about how a poor ranch hand suddenly has the money to buy up land, about why the widow from the city ended up here under such peculiar circumstances." Lila's spine stiffened. "You mean they want gossip?" The sheriff's jaw tightened. "They want answers. Truth be told, I do too. I've known you both a long time, but there are gaps in the story. Best you fill them before someone else does." Eli's gaze flicked to Lila, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. Then, with a slow nod, she rose from her chair. "Fine. You want the story? Here it is." Her voice didn't shake as she spoke. She told them about the arrangement, how her family had pressured her into marrying to salvage her reputation, how Eli had agreed because the money would keep the ranch afloat. She told them about the early days, the mistrust, the slow and reluctant steps towards something real. She told them how she'd found out he wasn't poor at all, that the ranch had always been his, inherited through a fortune he'd hidden to test who would stand beside him without it. Eli took over then, speaking plainly. "I didn't lie to hurt her. I lied because I'd spent my life surrounded by people who wanted what I had, not who I was. I needed to know she wasn't one of them, and I learned I was wrong about her. She was more than I deserved from the start." Silence fell over the porch. The sheriff studied them both, then looked back at the crowd. There were murmurs, some skeptical, some softening, but it was old Mrs. Harper, the baker's widow, who stepped forward first. "Sounds to me like you two made something out of nothing, and I reckon that's worth more than any pile of money." One by one, the others began to disperse, some with nods of respect, others still shaking their heads, but no longer pressing for blood. The sheriff gave Eli a curt nod before following them down the trail. When the last rider vanished over the rise, the ranch seemed to exhale. Lila leaned against the doorway, her shoulders sagging. "I thought they'd never leave." Eli stepped to her side, his hand brushing her cheek. "They might not believe us today, or tomorrow, but we're not here for their approval, Lila." Her eyes softened. Then who are we here for? He smiled faintly. For us. For the life we've built. For the herd out there that needs tending. For every sunrise we get to see together. They walked hand in hand to the fence line, where the cattle grazed lazily under the fading light. In the distance, the horizon burned with the colors of sunset, a reminder that even the harshest day could end in beauty. And though the world had come to their door with suspicion and judgment, it had left them with something unshakable, proof that their love could stand against anything.